Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for certainly one of the most interesting topics that we'll talk about during the conference, mergers and acquisitions. And we've got a great panel with perspectives from Becton Dickinson, from Medtronic, from Hologic, and an investment banker to keep them all honest. So with that, I thought what we could do is just talk about the agenda of what we're going to cover today. 2021 was a record year for mergers and acquisitions in medtech, and we'll go through some of the data, but just spectacular results, and all these guys participate in that. What we're going to talk about are the strategies that they utilized to be successful in the market conditions that we saw in 2021. And then last and most important, we're going to turn to 2022 and see, what are the real dynamics that are going to take place over the next year. So with that, I wanted to just get the panel introduced, and Azadeh, maybe you can lead us off.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's very bright, so if you see some blinking, Azadeh Nasibi with Medtronic, Neurovascular Operating Unit. I lead strategy, business development, and integration. Have been in the space for almost 12 years, and really excited to be here with all of you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Matthew Schopp, work in connected care under Philips in business development, focused on sleep and respiratory patient monitoring, some ambulatory monitoring diagnostics, and our emergency care business as well.
Good afternoon, Matthew Vessa, Vice President of Strategy Business Development for Hologic, working within the breast and skeletal health business. Incredible focus and franchise within breast cancer care and growing from there.
Antonio Sanchez-Cordero, responsible for business development integration for Becton Dickinson peripheral intervention. Glad to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
And Mike Robinson, I'm a managing director with Jeffries, part of a group of about 110 healthcare investment bankers kind of based around the world. I'm focused exclusively on medical devices and have been in the business about as long as John has.
Yeah, that means we're old.
That's what it means.
But I think the other thing that we're going to accomplish with five panelists and a moderator is we're going to have the highest person-to-panel ratio here until people get back from lunch. But with the great weather and being from Minnesota, I have to say I wouldn't come back. But everybody wants to talk about mergers and acquisitions, and what we thought would make sense is just to start with some framework from what we saw in over the last year. And certainly in the medtech sector, there was a lot to be really super happy about. Revenues approached almost $500 billion, growth of 10% over 2020. And yeah, there was a lot of interruption, but there was also a lot of a rebound and really showed a lot of opportunity and resiliency across the industry. Public valuations, at least through the end of the year, had really performed pretty spectacularly, especially high growth medtech, and outperforming pharma and biotech, which is always the peer group. So a lot to be positive about that. Obviously, over the last 3 months, that's taken a little bit of a correction. One of the things that we're going to talk about here today is what are the implications for M&A coming out of that. And then, as you can see all the way up in the right, and this is one of the things that the industry was really proud of, is that during the pandemic, R&D spending actually increased almost 17% across the industry. $24 billion plugged into research and development. And, a lot of these companies were, part of that, whether that was diagnostic tests, whether that was ventilators, really responding to, the pandemic. And, on the bottom left, it did not go unnoticed from the private capital market, or the equity markets. $34 billion raised, which was a record. $9 billion in venture capital, also a record. SPACs, $4 billion raised. We're going to talk about that as well, because you can't have a discussion without SPACs these days. And what we also saw was a lot of strategic investment into data. Really using digital as the currency to move care from the acute setting in the hospitals into ASCs and into the home. Also, a lot of discussion around connected care, and we've got some panelists, as you heard, that are participating in those sectors. So when we kind of sat and looked at the universe, what does it bode for 2022? We said, look, there's some tailwinds, like, unbelievable firepower sitting on, all these guys' balance sheet. It's over 600, and that's not a million, it's a billion. So over $500 billion that's sitting on the balance sheet ready to be deployed, whether it's internal programs or external to things like mergers and acquisitions. And a lot of need to build capabilities, especially when you look at the introduction of all these digital capabilities of AI, connected care. There's a lot of gaps that need to be filled. But, we weren't, just coming to the table with rose-colored glasses. There were a lot of, potential headwinds, not the least of which is certainly the public markets volatility these days. COVID variants, seem to peek their head up, that leads to hospital staffing shortages, and just things that, just give a little bit of indigestion across the industry. But, the facts don't lie. I mean, if you look at last year, 2021, 64 deals, over $100 billion in M&A, it was a record year by all accounts. And, one of the dynamics that we saw kind of creeping into the calculus as we exited 2021 was that high growth med tech, and this represents the multiple of forward revenue, increase, from roughly 10 times revenue before the pandemic to almost 14 times forward revenue, kind of coming out. And so those valuations, and now these have come down. I haven't wound this forward to 2022. Obviously, it'll look a little bit different, as we all know. But still, they're trading well above their historical highs. And if you look at the bottom graph, where have the M&A valuations been? Over the last 10 years, it's roughly 3.5 times forward revenue. If you look at the last year, it kind of creeps up to almost 10. And so, as you can kind of do the rough math, 14 is greater than 10. How are these guys, developing strategies to be successful in their M&A endeavors? And that's one of the things that we're going to unpack. And as I alluded to before, no M&A conversation would be complete if you didn't talk about SPACs. Certainly the talk of the town in 2021. We'll get some perspective here today about how people are participating in those and what the expectations are for 2022. I think the bottom line is, 71 active SPACs, average capital raise of $200 million, but 77% of those are trading below the initial value, and they're experiencing upwards of 41% redemption rates. And so, a lot to unpack there. I think one of the other things that we'll talk about is, will that capital, if it's returned to the shareholders, will that recirculate in other corners of the medtech sector, and how will that occur? So, with that, we're going to open it up to our panel and get their thoughts, and I think we can, really dig right into it. And we have two Matthews on the panel, so we're going to go affectionately by Matthew V and Matthew S. And we'll start out with both the Matthews. But, it would be interesting to get your guys' perspective. I mean, we went through a lot of the data, 2021 off the charts. 22 starts off with a real, I think, a lot of velocity. Quidel, OCD, Stryker, Vocera, Medtronic, Affera. But it seems like over, since we've gotten a little bit of this public company or public trading volatility, that maybe a little bit of the foot on the gas has come off. But, as you guys look at, kind of where you guys are today, is the M&A still full force ahead like what we saw? Matthew V, if we can maybe go there first.
Yeah, I would say definitely no relief in terms of how we're looking to deploy capital. Very strong balance sheet in terms of where Hologic sits today. We've been building a pipeline for more than a couple of years and steadily and methodically doing the transactions that make sense for us, but certainly not moving unnecessarily quickly just because of the fervor in the market.
Yeah. And Matthew S., maybe some perspective from your lens.
Yeah, I think just to echo that, it's the same at Philips, right? We have fully divested the businesses that were not healthcare related or health tech related. So we have a strong balance sheet as well, and are open to large acquisitions as well as continuing to execute on our pipeline and work tuck-ins to augment what we already have acquired in 21.
Great. And Mike, you might have, maybe a different kind of perspective. I mean, are companies still, pursuing with the same vigor, and, maybe even more importantly to the, emerging companies in the audience, are we seeing the number of sales kind of, processes kind of come to the market?
Yeah, I think the volatility of the equity markets is definitely having and will have an impact on M&A activity. I mean, for one thing, when the markets are this volatile, there is no IPO market. So that, as an alternative, that's kind of shut, and will remain so, I think, until, the VIX, the volatility index, kind of gets below 20 and stays there. SPAC market is highly correlated to the IPO market, so SPAC alternatives kind of off the table. So, I think one of the implications of this volatility is the balance of power shifted towards buyers, to people up here on this panel, with their giant balance sheets, and also private equity, for sure. Yeah. So, we would expect to see the buyers being more aggressive. We haven't really seen that yet. I mean, I think the last 3 weeks with, the invasion in Ukraine, everybody sort of pauses a little bit. It's hard to really lean forward right into that, but I certainly think the environment is set for a lot of activity, a lot of capital to be deployed, but it's starting a little bit slow, and it may be, for that reason.
Yeah. And then, Azadeh, maybe round that out, because Medtronic off to a fast start with the Affera deal. How are you guys, viewing kind of the current situation? Yeah,
and Affera was outside of sort of the neuroscience deals, but I think similar, we have our steadfast strategies and priority areas, and while, COVID and what's going on in the markets will cause potential blips and, perhaps, some reconfiguration or readjusting of focus and strategies, but when you think of, what's important short-term versus midterm and long-term, you kind of have to, keep that in mind, and it really hasn't changed much from a neurovascular stroke perspective. And our priority areas, I mean, we do a lot of tuck-ins because it makes sense for us. And, we had stuff that was in flight just as COVID happened, and we still stayed steady and went through and went on to other things as well during the last couple of years. So I would say from where we look and what we see, it's still healthy.
So more of the tailwinds to come, and more of 2021 to continue. And Matthew S., on the one of the themes that we saw in 2021 was the connected care, and obviously a big deal with biotelemetry. Mm-hmm. I mean, just maybe again with a lot of entrepreneurs in the room, how should they be viewing the connected care space, and where are the big gaps that you guys are kind of seeing on that front? Yeah, and our biotelemetry acquisition, and for those of you who don't know, they're one of the main players in cardiac monitoring for mobile cardiac telemetry and Holter monitoring. And they provide both the product to do the monitoring as well as the service then for the clinicians. And in 2021, that was really another business for us to acquire. And since then, we've been looking to build upon that with the acquisition of Cardiologs, which just closed this year. It's not just about the product or the service, but it's also about how much data you're getting and gathering, and how can you better process and use that data, both to help the clinicians and help the patient at the same time. So a lot of what we hear from clinicians is it's so much data, and we just can't handle it. So being able to help both the patient with a better product, as well as the clinician with some AI and some data capabilities is really what we're looking to do across all of our businesses. Yeah, no, that's data is the new frontier for sure, and I think it's been interesting to see, a lot of your organizations, Medtronic included, bring on new heads of digital, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where those investments are going to really land. Antonio, BD was extremely active, and I think caught a lot of people by surprise because there were a couple of big deals that you guys were still digesting, but a number of tuck-ins. Will that continue to be the strategy at BD?
Yeah, definitely, John. I'd love to be a bit original and disagree with my panelists, but truly we have a very clear strategy. We have a pipeline. In our case, it's around smart connected care. It's about new care settings. It's about improving chronic disease outcomes. And we're going to try to do as much as we can in those areas that is strategic and that is connected to our platform. So definitely, I think we continue to see activity from BD.
Yeah. And one of the interesting areas where you guys played was on the SPAC front in 2021. And maybe tell the audience, for those that don't know, some of the areas that you guys have looked at and or kind of considered, because I think I found it intriguing for sure.
Yeah, so I wasn't involved. I mean, it was I joined BD a year ago, so I wasn't involved in the Vicarious deal. But certainly, I think that we're talking about availability of capital. I think that also means there's a bit of a more open-minded attitude, both from institutionals, from the stakeholders, and as well from corporates. So I think that creativity it's going to continue, and we are using some of that creativity as we think about some scenarios where there might be win-win opportunities to work with other players.
Yeah. And Mike, interested to get your perspective as being the banker. Where does, I mean, obviously SPACs were all the talk in 2021, but now we're here in 2022. Do they gain some sort of momentum, or and then what happens if all that cash goes back to the original investors?
Yeah, I mean, I hope they gain momentum. If they do, that means that volatility has come down and the IPO market has opened up.
Yeah.
I don't think we're optimistic about that right now. I mean, when you look at the performance of IPOs in 2021, it's actually pretty rough. IPOs, all sectors, down something like 45% from their issue price. In medtech, it's also negative. Biotech, it's really negative. So you have to see that turn around before IPOs and SPACs can become relevant again. I mean, you just can't lose money in these things. Vicarious is trading around $5, and these are really good companies, but there's been a real pullback in terms of appetite for risk. So we don't really see. The crystal ball doesn't show us when SPACs are going to be a player in doing deals. As far as the second part of your question, John, the capital flowing back, kind of remains to be seen. I think most of the expirations are really happening in the fourth quarter, so it's going to be back-end loaded. Yeah. So I don't think it's going to have a big impact in 22. Maybe it'll have an impact in 23. On the other hand, a lot of the shareholders of the SPACs, the guys have traded out. And it's often, just pure hedge funds who aren't necessarily healthcare people.
Yeah.
So a little bit up in the air, but it's so much capital that even if a little flows back, you'll feel some effect. But I think it's more of a 23 dynamic at this point.
Yeah. So maybe turn the page to capital allocation. I think one of the more interesting dynamics in medtech right now is, the real funding and introduction of healthcare IT into the environment, and then also kind of layering on that a need to have product innovation. And Azadeh, maybe you can take us through your business, because I think it's an interesting subset and certainly illuminating for a lot of the audience around when do you kind of look at M&A and when do you look at partnerships like what your group has done historically? Yeah,
and specific to healthcare IT here. So just to give a little bit of background, I didn't provide this in the introduction. So the neurovascular business within Medtronic, it's our stroke business, right? So we have acute ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke, and the devices that go through the vessels right up to the brain. to pull. They're very much mechanical devices, mechanical therapy, so no sort of data and whatnot associated with it, but that's just for the procedure and the intervention. When you look at the overall patient journey and the care continuum opportunities for that patient, that's where we, from our perspective, see a lot of opportunity for data and AI, and especially as you go upstream to the procedure and say, okay, how can more strokes and more patients be triaged better and faster to get to the therapy and to the intervention, which again is benefits the patient, the physicians, the community, as well as the companies in the space. So but that's not a core competency of ours. So so where we've started is with partnerships like Viz AI, where they offer a cloud-based mobile platform for any stroke system. If you're on it, essentially, the physician can be on call at home, at a soccer game, wherever, and they get an alert, and a stroke is identified, and they, essentially start the triage for the whole system before they don't even have to pick up a phone. And so that's where we've partnered, started in US, now it's in Europe as well, as we think about where else should we play in the care continuum for our patients. So that's an example.
No, it's a fantastic example, and I think it's going to become, more relevant as a lot of these technologies don't make sense to acquire, but they make sense to have to be from a capability perspective. Right. And Matt V, in 2021, it wasn't as much about capital allocation, but it was sitting on all the COVID cash and how to double down and kind of deploy it. So walk us through sitting on some of those decision makings. How did you guys kind of survey the landscape and decide the right choice was to go down M&A versus R&D or returning cash to shareholders?
Yeah, so coming through COVID, we were definitely one of the beneficiaries as a diagnostics company and having one of the top COVID enabled technologies. Coming back to your initial question though, around how we're thinking about M&A, it's forced us to think about bigger opportunities, obviously. It's also forced us to continue with our tuck-in strategy, because I think, as we'll talk about, value creation effectively is more tied to tuck-ins. But the nice thing is having that leisure to, and not leisurely, but the leisure to look at some of these bigger, potentially transformational opportunities, not like Bard and BD coming together, but the sort of methodical nature that these deals won't happen overnight. Just because this is the year that we're looking and shopping, it doesn't mean we won't do a deal maybe in the following year, 2023. So it's been very much a full court press, all hands on deck, looking through a lot of potential opportunities, reviewing strategies, what if this, then that. But as Azadeh talked about, there's still this, we've got deals and gaps in our portfolio we need to consider. But to your other point, the make-buy-ally strategy is always in the forefront of our minds. As we think about software, as we think about new devices and imaging systems, we have a lot of those capabilities built in, but I think it's about appropriately and fairly measuring where we are versus an earlier stage company that can do things faster or be more in tune when you start from zero and build your software to today's protocols.
No, that's certainly a admirable and enviable problem to have. And you get company, we don't have Thermo on the panel, but certainly them going out and acquiring a $1 billion CRO, it's the art of the possible. Matthew S., just one last thought maybe on capital allocation because obviously Philips, you got the heavy iron side of the business, you got the technology side of the business. I mean, how do you guys kind of divide and conquer to make sure that you've got kind of adequate coverage or that the best opportunities are kind of getting adequately funded?
Sure. Again, it all starts with, like all the other panelists have talked about, with the strategy. It starts with the clinical problem. It starts with understanding what does the patient need, what does the clinician need, what capabilities do we have in-house. So there's a constant evolution of the strategy and looking at different ways that we can execute on it. And if it makes more sense to do it organically, then we'll do that. If it makes more sense to do it inorganically, whether that's putting a few seeds in the ground with investments and looking to grow for a couple of years from now, we'll do that. And if it makes sense to go out and buy right now, then we'll go and do that.
Yeah, certainly gives a lot of opportunity for the guys and gals in the audience, for sure. Yeah. Hey, and Antonio, maybe one thing that came up around supply chain, and I know you had a great phrase when we were prepping, a COVID-proof deal. And maybe explain to the audience, what your guys' kind of definition of that is, because I found it a bit intriguing.
Yeah, I think that the last couple of years have been sort of unprecedented in a number of ways, and with our portfolio being large enough and comprehensive enough that we have sort of a natural hedge, right? Because when COVID was getting worse, our diagnostic business would get better. Those that, businesses that depend on elective procedures would obviously see the pain. I think from a strategy perspective and from a deal perspective, we start thinking about, are there deals, are there areas that are sort of COVID-proof? I think as we coming out, hopefully, out of this COVID pandemic, that has transformed a bit into more understanding the effects of the supply chain, and are there assets that are more attuned, that are more protected from supply chain disruption? Because it feels this is here to stay. I don't know if 3 months, 6 months, or 3 years, but it certainly doesn't feel it's going to go away easily. So certainly we're trying to understand when we look at targets now, how susceptible are they to supply chain disruption? Is there something that we can do about that?
Yeah. And Mike, I'd be interested to get the banker perspective. Are you seeing any processes kind of get delayed because they can't get product to market, or that, just that supply chain element kind of creeping into M&A?
Yeah, I would say actually not. I think in M&A there's typically a mindset and an approach and a comfort level with making adjustments to results, whether they be COVID adjustments or anything that can be sort of positioned as a one-time type of item. To Antonio's comment, to the extent that we think we're going to be having these one-timers for 3 years, that's a different story, because that's not a one-timer anymore. But I think, at least over the last couple of years, we haven't seen deals not get done because there's a problem, there was a hiccup in the supply chain.
Yeah.
At the moment, acquirers are willing to sort of look beyond that, make an adjustment, and look at the opportunity on that basis.
Okay. Now, I think that's the general consensus. It'll be interesting to kind of pay attention to, and does this latest, wrinkle kind of maybe throw more than just a ripple in the water, which hopefully not. Maybe just taking a step back and looking at the, COVID and, your priorities and how you think about the portfolio. Azadeh, did it really kind of change or influence, kind of any of the thinking around your portfolio?
Honestly, it didn't, and we have somewhat of a COVID-proof portfolio within the stroke business, because it's not, it's not a very elective or wait-and-see type procedure or patient population for most of our therapies and devices. I think we did get better as we look at deals to think more granularly about certain risks, especially with supply chain and other things, and just have better mitigation plans and think about those perhaps a little bit more depth than we did before, because we didn't think that certain raw materials are going to be on back order for literally 50 weeks, for some of these companies. And then how can we then as Medtronic leverage sort of our scale and even sort of buying power and negotiation power to actually alleviate some of those risks that some of the smaller companies that we're interested in are experiencing. So really the long-term strategies remain, it was, having figured out how to even do diligence in a remote type of
Without doing a plant
setting.
tour, yeah.
We figured out some FaceTime stuff, video stuff when everything was, no travel whatsoever, complete shutdown. And I think it's actually kind of made us better and more flexible in how we think about risk and execute deals.
Do you think that that'll stay the standard or not? Because this is like the first time I've been to like a conference.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, will that stick, or do you think it'll go back to where it was, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I think there will be somewhere in between. I think that you can never replace, like if you're doing a site to visit and walk through, you can never sort of fully replace that in person. But we've certainly learned how to manage without it. And so, in fact, could we then be faster and better because there's some things we can do more remote and not having to be in a place and augmented with a follow-up visit. But I think it's been good experience and good learnings for us as we have gone through some deals. And
It has certainly been
during
enlightening.
this time. Yep.
For sure. And then maybe just a couple thoughts on the regulatory front. And Matthew asked, maybe, anything that you're seeing that is an M&A impediment or that people should be paying attention to, whether it's the FDA or some of the FDA has a new cyber czar or the FTC, just any regulation that you're seeing or you guys are paying attention to on that front?
Yeah, I think COVID certainly had some positive and negative impacts. The timelines for regulatory seem to be taking longer than usual, which everyone has adjusted to the new normal there. But it also brought some reimbursement and virtual care opportunities to the table. I think we're still working on figuring out, and everyone's waiting to see whether those will stick and be made permanent.
Yeah.
And a lot of people hope that they are, but we still don't know yet.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, then, so looking at SAMHSA or software as a medical device and the regulatory there, that's continuing to evolve, but has definitely gotten a lot clearer when it comes to using data and the regulatory pathway there. Which has been great for us in the connected care business.
Yeah. Matthew V., anything that you guys are paying attention to at Hologic?
So a few things. It used to be that you would launch a medical device in Europe first because the regulatory hurdles were easier, and then we've moved to the U.S. being a little bit easier. I think it's being conscious of both of those markets. Obviously, there's pros and cons to establishing commercial footprints in both of those markets. But we're looking at deals where, with the more encumbered European CE process, we're thinking about how that impacts the deal model. How does that impact the traditional M&A metrics? And then just a related point as it relates to FTC, we know there's a tough FTC today. There's close examination for any big company doing a deal, especially around areas of innovation where there's effectively a concentration in share that can potentially disenfranchise customers. So that's an important thing that we watch when we look at transactions.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting because it seems that there's no problem with big companies like Baxter buying Hillrom, but there's a lot of angst about big companies buying small companies, which impacts this audience pretty directly. We're coming down to maybe some of the last thoughts here. I guess with all the international considerations that are going on now, and high growth markets like China, and I know for Philips that's been a high growth, as well as Medtronic. How are you guys thinking about M&A maybe outside of the United States, or just the overall OUS and/or China strategy? Azadeh, I don't know if you have any thoughts to share there.
Yeah, and for stroke and neurovascular, China is one of our largest markets. Yeah. And value-based pricing is just starting to happen for our business there, but not quite to the extent that it's been happening in other segments. So, and there's still a lot of under-penetration in terms of the actual therapies and patients getting the therapies they need for stroke. So huge opportunity and lots of local competition. I mean, there's so much capital that's been deployed in China for local startups that are now competing with multinationals. So far, they still haven't quite gotten to sort of the level of evidence and performance with our therapies and the multinational therapies. So there's still an advantage, but they're going to catch up, right? So we certainly look at any global M&A. We do a deep focus on what does this mean for China, what would it look like, and also look at alternatives, strategies for, does it make sense to do something for China only in something in particular? But it definitely always has the spotlight in any of our M&A strategies because it is such an important market. And high growth. And on the regulatory front too, there's some things there that actually has, because of EU MDR, has brought to light. And I won't get into too much details, but there's some, I'm sure if you haven't run into this yet, you might, but animal-derived materials and how to work around that, because that's actually not been allowed in China for a long time, but it hadn't been known for many components until EU MDR forced it to be known. So it has had some ripple effects there, so there's a lot going on with how to be in the China market and how to get new product in there. So
yeah. And Matthew, anything to add from a Philips perspective? I think you guys always have a unique lens on this.
Yeah, so coming from other large medtech companies that always said global is a focus, and it really was. And moving to Philips about a year and a half ago, Philips is based in the Netherlands. Yeah. So if we don't come forward with a global plan, and we look U.S. only, we look like a fool to management. So it's a really strong focus. It's not to say that we won't consider technologies that are currently only in one market, but we definitely want to consider what does it look like to bring that global, or what are the different solutions globally that may be needed based on specific market needs.
Yeah, and Mike, maybe, we've got a lot of entrepreneurs in the crowd. If they're shaping an M&A strategy, and I know that you can't have just an M&A strategy, but, what are 2 or 3 of the arrows that they really need in their quiver that you're seeing that are kind of, these guys, must-haves?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost that you need to run your business to build it and not to sell it, because these guys can sense, weakness. It's a little bit tougher now in that, as we discussed, the IPO market isn't available sort of as an alternative. That said, there's a fair amount of private capital out there available for late stage, and maybe many of the companies in here may be experiencing this. I know I am. I've had private company clients that have gotten inbounds, from institutional investors who want to put capital to work, and I think, that's always a good strategy, right? To have enough capital, raise the capital when you don't need it, so that you don't need it at a time when you can't get it. But I really think it's kind of fundamentally that. I mean, just kind of don't build to sell. You got to build it to build it, and do everything you can to take as much risk out of the equation as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's sage advice. We're down to the short strokes here, and I think it would be a good time to maybe do a lightning round of what we think is one thing to watch for kind of as we go forward in 22 with Medtech M&A. And Antonio, we're going to put you on the hot seat here real quick, lightning round. What should we watch out for?
Yeah, I think Matthew mentioned before is the focus on clinical value, right? I mean, for us, when we look at, we have our strategies and we're trying to help more patients, help more healthcare professionals, and it goes down to clinical value. And I think in those conversations with the startups, with entrepreneurs, it's really understanding how that value plays in the bigger picture. And we're very supportive of those discussions, but it needs to start on clinical value and not on cool technology. And so I think with that in mind, when the conversation starts there, it tends to go to a good spot. I think we're growing more agile in our make by partner strategy, and so we can adapt. There's lots of things that we can do if there is clinical value. If there's no clinical value, sort of everything else doesn't matter.
Yeah. Matthew?
Yeah, I would add on to that clinical value at the multi-stakeholder level, so clinician, hospital, patient, and within the hospital thinking, clearly about economics. If reimbursement doesn't seem like it's an option, having a value creation story that's tied to something else that's measurable, material, and that customers care about.
Matthew S.
Yeah, I think focusing not just on the better next product, but how do you make things cheaper? How do you make the lives of the clinicians easier when they're running into staffing shortages and they need help as much as the patients do?
Yeah. Azadeh.
Yeah, so I'll focus more on maybe types of deals and from our perspective, kind of moving into more of the partnerships and structured deals and doing things that are maybe not your traditional, outright acquisition or asset acquisition, in order to hit on some of the things that have been talked about, right? If it's something is early enough, you see the potential, you see the signals, but how do you validate some of it through either a partnership or through investment with very key milestones? I think, at least from our lens, there'll be more of those types of activities in our space.
Yep, I think so as well. And I'm going to throw one bold prediction. I think we will get at least one deal over $10 billion. That's my bold prediction. So, and I know Mike and I would like nothing better than to see that. So,
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. Well, hey, everyone, we have hit triple zeros up here. Can you help me just give a token of applause for our panelists? I thought this was really great.